I'm Eliza Rodriguez, 25 years old. I walked into Portland General Hospital carrying hope. Hope for reconciliation, maybe even a chance to finally bridge the gap that had divided our family for 7 years. But instead of the tender bedside moment I'd imagined, I was struck with something far worse than any physical blow. It came in the form of words, sharp and cutting, meant to shatter what little connection remained between us. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I rushed through the sterile corridors, my heart pounding with each step. The call had come at 3 a.m. Dad was dying. After months of battling pancreatic cancer, his body was finally giving up. I'd driven straight from my small Portland apartment, not even stopping to change out of my worn jeans and conservation nonprofit t-shirt. Room 314. The door was already open when I arrived, and I could hear the rhythmic beeping of machines keeping my father alive. Robert Rodriguez, 58. The man who'd built a farming empire from nothing, now lay unconscious among a tangle of tubes and wires. His weathered hands, once strong enough to plow fields and build barns, lay still against the white hospital sheets. My mother, Linda, sat beside the bed, her eyes red from crying. At 55, she still looked elegant despite her grief, her graying hair pulled back in the same neat bun she'd worn for as long as I could remember. When she saw me, her face crumpled with fresh tears. "Mija, I'm so glad you came." But before I could respond, another voice cut through the room like ice. "I'm surprised she bothered showing up at all." My brother Derek stood by the window, his expensive suit perfectly pressed despite the early hour. At 28, he'd inherited our father's business instincts, but none of his humility. His dark eyes held the same calculating look I remembered from childhood, the look that always preceded one of his schemes. "Derek," I said quietly, moving toward our father's bedside, "this isn't the time." "Actually, it's the perfect time." Derek's voice carried that familiar smugness that had always made my skin crawl. "Dad might not be conscious, but there are things you need to know about his final wishes." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. "What are you talking about?" Derek reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. His smile was cold, calculated, victorious. "Dad changed his will 6 months ago. The Rodriguez family farm, all 200 acres, the equipment, the contracts, everything, goes to me. You get nothing." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. "That's impossible. Dad would never." "Wouldn't he?" Derek interrupted, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "You abandoned this family years ago, Eliza. You chose tree hugging over the family business. You made it clear you thought we were all beneath your environmental principles." My mother's grip on my hand tightened. "Derek, por favor, not now." "When, Mama?" "When she comes crawling back asking for handouts?" Derek opened the folder and spread legal documents across the small bedside table. "It's all here, signed and notarized." Dad realized that the farm needed someone who actually cared about success, not just saving the spotted owl. I stared at the papers, seeing my father's signature at the bottom of each page. The familiar scrawl that had signed my childhood birthday cards and school permission slips now condemned me to nothing. The beeping of the heart monitor seemed to get louder, matching the pounding in my chest. "He was sick," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "You manipulated him while he was sick." Derek's laugh was harsh. "I opened his eyes to reality. You left home at 18 and barely visited. You turned your back on everything he built. Did you think he'd reward that kind of ingratitude?" My mother looked between us, tears streaming down her face. "Please, mis hijos, your father is dying. Can't we just what, Mama?" "When she comes crawling back asking for handouts?" Derek softened his voice when he spoke to her, but his eyes remained hard when they found mine. I looked down at my father's still face, searching for any sign that he could hear us, that he might wake up and tell Derek he was wrong. But Robert Rodriguez lay silent, his breathing shallow and labored. The man who'd taught me to plant seeds when I was 5, who'd carried me on his shoulders through the cornfields, who'd once told me I could be anything I wanted to be, had written me out of his life completely. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply looked back at Derek, my heart breaking, but my voice steady. "You're lying."
The lawyers don't lie, hermana. Derek began gathering the papers. James Morrison handled everything. It's all legal, all final. Dad saw you for what you really are, a disappointment who cares more about saving the world than saving her own family. The room fell silent, except for the mechanical sounds of the life support machines. Every breath my father took felt like another nail in the coffin of our relationship. Linda squeezed my hand, but even she couldn't meet my eyes. Without saying another word, I kissed my father's forehead and walked out of room 314. But as I reached the elevator, I made myself a promise. I would find out exactly how Derek had convinced our dying father to destroy our family, and I would make sure he understood that underestimating me was the biggest mistake he'd ever made. The drive back to my apartment felt like navigating through fog. My hands gripped the steering wheel as Derek's words echoed in my mind. "You abandoned this family." The accusations stung, because part of me wondered if it was true. Had my choice to study environmental science instead of business, to work for conservation nonprofits instead of the family farm, really been abandonment? My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Kim, my best friend since college. "How's your dad? Call me when you can." Instead of calling, I found myself driving past my apartment building toward the outskirts of Portland, where the Rodriguez family farm spread across rolling hills. Even at 5 a.m., the place held a beauty that had always called to my soul. The organic gardens my father had reluctantly agreed to let me plant during high school were overgrown now, but somehow still thriving. I parked near the old barn and called Tom Bradley, our farm manager for the past 20 years. Tom had been like a second father to me, teaching me about soil health and crop rotation when I was barely tall enough to see over the corn stalks. "Eliza?" His voice was gravelly with sleep. "What's wrong, mija?" "Tom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." I took a deep breath. "Has Derek been coming around the farm lately, talking to Dad about the business?" There was a long pause. "Eliza, I don't want to get in the middle of family business. Please, Tom, Dad changed his will. Derek gets everything and I get nothing. I need to understand how that happened." Another pause, longer this time. "Derek's been here almost every week since your father got sick, always bringing paperwork, always talking about how the farm needed real leadership. He kept saying you didn't understand the business side, that you were too idealistic to handle real responsibility." My heart sank. "And Dad believed him?" "Your father was scared, mija. Scared of dying, scared of leaving the farm in the wrong hands. Derek painted a picture of you as someone who would sell everything to create some kind of nature preserve. He said you told people the farm was unsustainable, that you were embarrassed by the family business." "I never said that. The words came out sharper than I intended. I suggested ways to make the operation more environmentally friendly, but I never said it was unsustainable." "I know that, but Derek, he has a way of twisting words, making them sound different than they were. He brought your father copies of your social media posts about climate change, made them sound like attacks on the farm. He even showed him that article you wrote for the environmental magazine." I remembered that article, a piece about how small family farms could lead the way in sustainable agriculture. I'd mentioned our farm as an example of potential for positive change. He made that sound like criticism? "Derek's got a silver tongue, mija, always has. He convinced your father that you saw the farm as a problem to be fixed, instead of a legacy to be preserved." After hanging up with Tom, I sat in my car watching the sun rise over the fields. The anger I'd been holding back finally erupted, but not in tears or screams. Instead, it crystallized into something harder, more focused.
Derek had systematically poisoned our relationship with our father, using Dad's illness and fear against both of us. My phone rang. Sarah. "I've been worried sick," she said without preamble. "How's your dad?" I found myself telling her everything. The hospital, Derek's smugness, the will, Tom's revelations. Sarah listened without interrupting, which was one of the many reasons I treasured our friendship. "That bastard," she finally said. "Eliza, you can't let him get away with this." "What choice do I have? The will is legal. Dad signed it." "Maybe, but there might be ways to challenge it. You need a lawyer, someone who specializes in elder abuse cases." "I can't afford to fight Derek in court. He's got the family money now." "What about Marcus? He's environmental law, but he'd know who to call."
Marcus Torres. I'd been trying not to think about him since leaving the hospital. We'd been dating for 8 months, and he'd been nothing but supportive of my work with the Sierra Club and local conservation groups. But this felt too big, too complicated to drag him into. "I don't know, Sarah. This is family business." "Family business?" Sarah's voice rose. "Eliza, this isn't some minor disagreement. Derek manipulated a dying man to steal your inheritance. That's not family business. That's fraud." An hour later, I was sitting in Marcus's kitchen while he made coffee with the same methodical precision he brought to everything. At 30, he had the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of fighting for underdogs in environmental cases. His dark hair was still messy from sleep, but his eyes were alert and focused as I told him about Derek's revelation. "This doesn't sound right," he said, setting a mug in front of me. "Even if your father wanted to change the will, the timing is suspicious. When someone's battling cancer, their mental state can be compromised by pain medication, stress, fear. A good lawyer would have been very careful about documenting mental capacity." "James Morrison has been the family lawyer for 15 years. Dad trusted him completely." Marcus frowned. "That might actually work against Derek. If Morrison had a long relationship with your father, he'd know this kind of complete disinheritance was out of character." Unless what? Unless Derek made it worth Morrison's while to look the other way. The possibility hadn't occurred to me, but now it seemed obvious. Derek had always believed that everyone had a price. If he could manipulate our dying father, bribing the family lawyer would be child's play. "I need to see Morrison. I need to understand exactly how this will change happened." Marcus nodded. "I'll go with you." "Marcus, you don't have to get involved in this mess." He reached across the table and took my hand. "Eliza, you're not just fighting for money. You're fighting for your family's respect, for your father's true legacy. That's worth fighting for." As I drove home to shower and change before confronting Morrison, I felt something I hadn't experienced since walking out of the hospital. Hope. Derek might have won the first battle, but I was just beginning to understand the war he'd started. And unlike our father, I wasn't sick, scared, or vulnerable to manipulation. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I was angry. I was determined. And I was about to discover just how much Derek didn't know about our family's real secrets. James Morrison's law office occupied the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian mansion in downtown Portland. I'd been there twice before, once when I was 16 and grandmother Esperanza died, and again when I turned 21 for some routine trust fund paperwork that I'd barely paid attention to. Now walking up those familiar stairs with Marcus beside me, every detail seemed significant. The receptionist, a woman I didn't recognize, smiled professionally. "Mr. Morrison is expecting you, Miss Rodriguez." That surprised me. I'd called just an hour ago, expecting to make an appointment for later in the week, but Morrison insisted on seeing me immediately, which should have been my first warning that something was wrong. Morrison's office had changed dramatically since my last visit. The old, comfortable furniture had been replaced with expensive leather chairs and a massive mahogany desk.
Abstract art covered the walls where family photos used to hang, and everything gleamed with the kind of polish that comes from serious money. Eliza. Morrison stood as we entered, but his smile seemed forced. At 62, he'd always been a small man, but now he looked almost shrunken in his expensive suit. Eliza, I was so sorry to hear about your father's condition. He's not dead yet, I said, perhaps more sharply than necessary. Morrison's eyes flicked to Marcus. And you are? Marcus Torres, Environmental Law. I'm here as Eliza's legal counsel. I hadn't asked Marcus to introduce himself that way, but I was grateful for the formality. Morrison's discomfort was immediately apparent. Of course, please, sit down. Morrison gestured to the chairs facing his desk, but remained standing himself, fidgeting with papers. I assume you're here about the will. I'm here because I don't understand how my father decided to leave me nothing after a lifetime of building that farm together. Morrison's laugh was nervous, artificial. Eliza, you have to understand your father's decision was entirely his own. I simply facilitated his wishes. His wishes? I leaned forward. James, you've known my family for 15 years. Does cutting me out completely sound like something my father would do? People change, especially when facing their own mortality. Your father was concerned about the farm's future. He felt that Derek had the business experience necessary to... What did Derek offer you? The question came from Marcus, delivered with the kind of calm directness that made Morrison's face go pale. I beg your pardon? This office renovation looks expensive. The new car in the parking lot with the dealer tags? The Rolex? Either you've had some very successful cases recently, or someone made it worth your while to facilitate this will change. I resent the implication that I would compromise my professional ethics for James. My father was on heavy pain medication. He was terrified of dying. Derek had unlimited access to him for months while I was working in Salem on the habitat restoration project. Are you telling me that in 15 years of knowing my father, you never once heard him express the desire to cut me out of his will? Morrison's hands were actually shaking now. Your father was of sound mind when he made his decision. I have documentation. What kind of documentation? Marcus pulled out a legal pad. Psychiatric evaluation, cognitive assessment, video testimony explaining his reasoning? The law requires that you ensure your client has mental capacity and isn't under undue influence. Given Mr. Rodriguez's medical condition and the dramatic nature of this change, any ethical attorney would have insisted on additional safeguards. Morrison stood abruptly, walked to his window overlooking the street. Your father made his decision. The will is legal and binding. I'm sure it is, I said quietly. But James, you've known me since I was a teenager. You handled Grandmother Esperanza's estate. You know I'm not the irresponsible child Derek painted me as.
Something in Morrison's shoulders sagged. Eliza, your father was convinced you didn't value the family business. Derek showed him articles you'd written, posts on social media. He made a compelling case that you saw the farm as an environmental problem rather than a family legacy. And you believed that? Morrison turned back to face me, and for a moment, his professional mask slipped. I believed your brother when he said he was protecting the family's interests. How much did he pay you? Marcus asked again. Morrison's silence was answer enough. There's something else, I said, remembering Tom's words about Derek's systematic campaign. Derek mentioned other family arrangements at the hospital. What other arrangements? Morrison's face went completely white. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. I stood up, moved closer to his desk. James, what else don't I know about my family's finances? Eliza, I think you should speak with... Morrison stopped himself mid-sentence, his eyes wide with panic. Speak with whom? No one. I misspoke. Marcus stood as well. Mr. Morrison, if there are other legal arrangements affecting Ms. Rodriguez's inheritance rights, she has a legal right to know about them. The will is public record once probated, that's all I can tell you. But his nervousness told a different story.
There were other arrangements, other lawyers, other secrets that Derek either didn't know about or had chosen not to share with me. As we walked back to Marcus's car, I felt that familiar sensation of missing puzzle pieces. He's hiding something. Obviously, the question is what, and whether it helps or hurts your case. I stopped walking. Marcus, when Grandmother Esperanza died, Morrison handled her will. But I remember being confused because there were some papers that didn't make sense to me at the time. I was only 16, and everyone told me not to worry about the details. What kind of papers? Property deeds, I think, but the land descriptions didn't match our farm. I asked Morrison about it, and he said it was just legal paperwork for some old family property that didn't matter. Marcus grabbed my arm. Eliza, what if your grandmother left you something separate from your father's will? Something Derek doesn't know about? The possibility hit me like lightning. Morrison's panic when I mentioned other family arrangements, his nervousness about Esperanza's estate, his insistence that I speak with someone else, someone he'd almost named before catching himself. I need to go back to Grandmother's old house, I said. There might be documents there, something that explains what Morrison is hiding. As we drove toward the house where Esperanza had lived until her death 3 years ago, I felt the balance of power beginning to shift. Derek thought he'd won by manipulating our father and buying off our lawyer, but he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed that Morrison was the only lawyer involved in our family's affairs. And now I was beginning to suspect that Grandmother Esperanza, the woman who taught me to question everything and trust my instincts, had been planning for exactly this kind of betrayal long before Derek ever thought to orchestrate it. Grandmother Esperanza's house sat on 2 acres just outside Portland, a modest craftsman that had been empty since her death 3 years ago. The family had been meaning to sell it, but somehow never got around to it. Now, as Marcus and I walked through the overgrown garden, I wondered if procrastination had been providence. The key was still hidden under the ceramic frog by the front steps, exactly where Esperanza had kept it. Inside, dust motes danced in afternoon sunlight streaming through lace curtains that hadn't been touched since her funeral. The familiar smell of lavender and old wood brought tears to my eyes. "What exactly are we looking for?" Marcus asked, running his finger along a dusty bookshelf. "I don't know. Something Morrison didn't want me to find." I started in Esperanza's bedroom, searching through the old wooden dresser where she'd kept important papers. Most drawers held the expected items: old photographs, prayer cards, costume jewelry. But in the bottom drawer, underneath a stack of embroidered handkerchiefs, I found something unexpected. Letters. Dozens of them, all addressed to Elena Vasquez, attorney at law, with a downtown Portland address I didn't recognize. "Marcus, look at this." I held up the correspondence. "These are all from the last 5 years of her life." He examined the letterhead. Elena Vasquez. I don't know her, but if she's practicing environmental law in Portland, our paths would have crossed. I opened one of the letters, dated just 6 months before Esperanza's death. Her handwriting, still elegant despite arthritis, covered 2 pages in Spanish. My grandmother had always insisted we speak English at home to help us assimilate, but apparently her private thoughts were different. "She's writing about protecting the land," I translated slowly. "Something about making sure the right person inherits. Someone who understands that money isn't the only measure of wealth." In Esperanza's sewing room, I found her old cedar chest, the one that had fascinated me as a child. Inside, beneath quilts she'd never finished, was a manila envelope sealed with wax. The wax bore her distinctive ring, the one with our family crest, that had belonged to her mother. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Inside were legal documents I couldn't fully understand, but the property descriptions made my heart race. They matched the land our farm sat on, but the ownership details were completely different from what I'd always believed. "Eliza," Marcus's voice was tight with excitement, "look at this date." I followed his finger to a property deed dated 15 years ago, 2 years before my father had supposedly bought the land for his farming operation. The deed showed that Eliza Rodriguez had purchased 200 acres from the previous owner, not Robert Rodriguez. "This doesn't make sense," I whispered. "Dad always said he bought this land himself, that it was his achievement." A handwritten note in the envelope explained everything. Mija, if you are reading this, then the family is fighting over money again. Your father believes he bought this land because I let him believe it. But the deed is in my name and now it will be in yours. Derek thinks he understands business, but he doesn't understand that you can't inherit what was never your father's to give. The land chooses its keeper. I choose you. Tu abuela que te ama. The bottom of the note contained an address. Elena Vasquez. She has been waiting for you. Elena Vasquez's law office occupied a renovated warehouse in Portland's Pearl District, far from the traditional downtown legal establishments. The space was modern but warm, with exposed brick walls covered in environmental law awards and photographs of successful conservation projects. Elena herself was nothing like what I'd expected from someone my conservative grandmother had trusted with family secrets.
At 65, Elena had silver hair cut in a sharp bob and wore a power suit that spoke of decades fighting tough legal battles. Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine, and her eyes held the kind of sharp intelligence that had probably intimidated countless opposing counsels. "Eliza Rodriguez," she said, gesturing for Marcus and me to sit in comfortable chairs facing her desk. "I've been waiting 3 years for you to walk through that door." "You knew I'd come?" "Your grandmother was very specific. She said that when the family tried to steal your inheritance, you'd be smart enough to find me." Elena opened a thick file that had been sitting on her desk. She was right about many things, but especially about you. Elena spread documents across her desk with the precision of someone who'd planned this moment for years. "Your grandmother came to me 5 years ago, concerned about your family's dynamics. She'd watched Derek manipulate situations since childhood and worried about what would happen when your parents were gone." "So she bought the farmland before my father could?" "Not exactly." Elena pulled out a survey map. "The land your family farms sits on 200 acres that Esperanza purchased outright 15 years ago. She then leased it to your father for his farming operation, allowing him to believe he was the owner. All the mortgage payments, improvements, and business investments he made were actually lease payments to her estate." My head spun. But why? Why let him think he owned it? "Because she understood men like your father. He needed to believe he'd built something himself. But she also understood men like Derek. She knew that someday someone would try to take what wasn't theirs to take." Elena handed me a legal document that made my hands shake. "This is your inheritance from Esperanza Rodriguez. Not just the land, but mineral rights, water rights, and development rights for 200 acres of prime agricultural property. Current estimated value, $3.2 million. Marcus let out a low whistle. "Derek's business inheritance is worthless without the land to operate on." "Precisely." Elena's smile was sharp. "Your brother has inherited farming equipment, client contracts, and business debt. But he can't farm without land, and he can't sell what he doesn't own." I stared at the deed with my name on it. "Why didn't you contact me sooner?" "Because your grandmother was very specific. She said that you needed to discover your own strength first, that if I simply handed you the victory, you wouldn't understand its value." Elena's expression softened. She wanted you to fight for yourself before you learned you'd already won. The documents showed more than just land ownership. Esperanza had established an environmental trust with strict guidelines for the property's use. The land could never be sold to developers, could never be strip mined or environmentally damaged. It had to remain agricultural, and any farming operation had to meet organic certification standards. "She knew," I whispered. "She knew exactly what Derek would try to do." "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman. She came to this country with nothing, watched her son build a business, but never forgot that the land itself was what mattered most. She chose you as her heir because she believed you understood that truth. Back at Marcus's apartment, we spread Elena's documents across his dining room table like battle plans. The magnitude of what I'd inherited was still sinking in. I wasn't just the victim of Derek's manipulation. I held all the power in this family conflict. The question now is how to handle this, Marcus said, studying the environmental trust requirements. You could simply evict Derek and take over the farming operation yourself. I shook my head. That's exactly what Derek would do, use power to destroy people. I want to be better than that. Sarah arrived with Chinese takeout and immediately grasped the situation. Wait, so Derek stole a business that can't operate without land he doesn't own? And you own the land? It's more complicated than that, I explained. Derek genuinely believes Dad built this farm. He doesn't know that Esperanza owned the property. In his mind, he's claiming his rightful inheritance. His rightful inheritance of property that was never his father's to give? Marcus pointed out. But what if we could find a way to keep the family together while still honoring Esperanza's wishes? I looked at the trust documents again. The environmental requirements actually align with sustainable farming practices. We could transform the operation into something that serves both the land and the community. Sarah set down her chopsticks. You want to offer Derek a partnership? I want to offer him a chance to prove he can change. The trust allows for sustainable farming operations. If Derek can commit to organic practices and community-supported agriculture, we work together. If not, you evict him and start over, Marcus finished. Elena had given me all the legal ammunition I needed, but the real strategy required understanding my family's psychology. Derek's entire identity was built on being the successful son, the business genius who would expand Dad's legacy. Learning that he'd inherited a hollow shell would devastate him. But learning it in a way that offered redemption instead of just humiliation, that might actually reach him. I need to get Derek and my parents together, I decided. Somewhere meaningful, somewhere that forces them to confront what the farm really represents to our family. The farmhouse, Marcus suggested, where you grew up. I nodded. The farmhouse kitchen table where we'd shared countless meals, fought countless battles, and made countless memories. If there was any hope of healing our family, it would start there. I'll call Derek tomorrow, tell him I want to discuss the transition, maybe negotiate some kind of small inheritance. I smiled for the first time in days. Let him think he's won completely. Let him get comfortable with his victory. And then, Sarah asked, then I introduce him to Elena Vasquez and show him exactly what he really inherited. The plan felt right in a way that simple revenge never could. Esperanza hadn't just left me the land, she'd left me the chance to transform our family's legacy from one of manipulation and greed into one of stewardship and cooperation. Whether Derek would accept that transformation was up to him. The Rodriguez family farmhouse kitchen looked exactly as it had during my childhood. Worn wooden table, mismatched chairs, and Mom's collection of ceramic roosters watching over everything. Derek sat confidently at the head of the table, architectural plans spread before him like a conquering general displaying battle maps. I'm glad you're being reasonable about this, Eliza, he said, not looking up from his drawings. These expansion plans will triple our revenue within 2 years. Mom shifted uncomfortably beside him. Dad, now home from the hospital but still weak, stared out the window toward the fields he believed he'd built. What exactly are you planning? I asked, studying Derek's sketches. Modern agriculture will convert the eastern 40 acres to industrial corn, bring in automated equipment, maximize yield per square foot. The organic gardens you planted can be plowed under. They're not profitable enough to justify the space. And the community-supported agriculture program Tom mentioned? Hippie nonsense. We're running a business, not a charity. That's when Elena Vasquez walked through the kitchen door. Derek's confident expression faltered. "Who is this?" "Derek, Mom, Dad," I said calmly. "I'd like you to meet Elena Vasquez, Grandmother Esperanza's attorney." Derek's face drained of color. "Grandmother's attorney? Morrison handled her estate." "Morrison handled her personal effects," Elena corrected, setting her briefcase on the table. "I handled her real property." Elena opened her briefcase with deliberate precision, withdrawing the documents that would change everything. "The land you're making plans for, Derek, doesn't belong to your father. It never did." Dad struggled to sit up straighter. "What are you talking about? I bought this land 15 years ago." "Robert, you've been leasing this land from your mother's estate for 15 years, Elena explained gently. "Esperanza purchased these 200 acres before you ever applied for your farming loan. She allowed you to believe you were the owner because she understood you needed that pride." Derek grabbed the property deed Elena handed him, his hands shaking as he read. "This is impossible." "Derek," I said quietly, "the business you inherited, the equipment, contracts, and debt, are worthless without land to operate on. And you don't own the land." Mom covered her mouth with both hands.
Grandmother left the land in an environmental trust. It requires sustainable farming, organic certification, community involvement. I leaned forward. "We can work together, Derek. Transform this place into something that honors both business success and environmental responsibility." For a moment, Derek just stared at me. Then his expression hardened. "You planned this. You orchestrated this whole thing." "No, Derek. Grandmother planned this. She saw exactly what would happen and protected our family's real legacy." The silence in the farmhouse kitchen stretched like a held breath. Derek sat frozen, staring at the property deed that had just destroyed his vision of agricultural empire. Mom reached across the table toward both of us, her face wet with tears. "Please, mis hijos, please don't let this destroy our family completely." Dad struggled to speak, his voice hoarse from weeks of illness. "Eliza, mija, I'm sorry. Derek convinced me you didn't care about the farm, that you saw it as—" "I know what he told you, Papa, but I never stopped loving this place. I just wanted it to be something we could be proud of in every way." Derek suddenly exploded from his chair, pacing to the window. 28 years old, and I've got nothing. Less than nothing. I've got business debt and no way to pay it." "You have a choice," I said firmly. "The Environmental Trust allows for profitable, sustainable farming, community-supported agriculture, organic certification, agritourism. We could build something bigger than either of us imagined alone." Derek turned back to face me, his expression cycling through anger, humiliation, and something that might have been desperate hope. "Why would you offer me anything after what I did?" "Because Grandmother Esperanza didn't leave me this land to punish you. She left it to heal our family." Elena gathered her papers. "I'll leave you to discuss this privately. Eliza, you have my number when you're ready to move forward." After Elena left, we sat in heavy silence. Finally, Dad spoke. "Derek, you told me Eliza called the farm unsustainable, that she was embarrassed by our work." Derek's face crumpled. "I was scared, Papa. Scared you'd choose her over me, like you always did when we were kids. She was always your favorite, so smart, so idealistic." "You were wrong," Dad said quietly. "You were both my children. I loved you both differently, but equally." Mom stood and moved to Derek. "Mijo, your sister is offering you partnership, not punishment. Can't you see that?" Derek looked at me across the table where we'd shared thousands of meals, fought countless sibling battles, and learned what family meant. What would this partnership look like? I pulled out the sustainable farming plans I'd been developing for years, the ones Derek had dismissed as hippie nonsense. Organic certification within 2 years, community-supported agriculture program, educational tours for schools. We keep the profitable crops, but add value through direct marketing. And I would manage the business side? Derek asked cautiously. We would manage it together. Your business skills, my environmental knowledge, Tom's farming experience. I met his eyes. Equal partners, Derek. Real partners. Derek studied the plans, his expression slowly changing. These profit projections, they're actually higher than my expansion plans. Sustainable farming isn't charity work, Derek. It's the future of agriculture. For the first time since the hospital, Derek looked at me like he was his sister instead of his enemy. I'm sorry, Eliza. I'm sorry for everything. 6 months later, the Rodriguez family farm looked nothing like Derek's industrial agriculture plans, and everything like the vision grandmother Esperanza had secretly nurtured. The morning sun illuminated neat rows of organic vegetables, heritage tomatoes climbing wooden trellises, and the restored native plant meadow that had become a favorite spot for visiting school groups. I stood in the farmhouse kitchen, now serving as our business office, reviewing the week's community-supported agriculture orders. 80 families now received weekly boxes of our produce, and the waiting list grew longer every month. The farmer's market revenue is up 30% from last month, Derek announced, entering with soil still on his boots. The change in him had been remarkable to watch. The designer suits were gone, replaced by work clothes and a farmer's tan. More importantly, the calculating coldness in his eyes had been replaced by genuine enthusiasm. Sarah's catering business wants to contract for all our herbs and specialty greens, I told him. And Marcus says the State Environmental Office is interested in featuring us as a model sustainable operation. Derek grinned, pulling up a chair to review the numbers with me. Remember when you used to say I only cared about profit? You were right, but now I understand that sustainable profit is the only kind that lasts. Tom Bradley knocked on the kitchen door, leading a group of middle schoolers from Portland who'd come for our weekly educational tour. Miss Rodriguez, the kids are here for the soil health demonstration. I grabbed my hat, then paused to look at the framed photo Elena had given us last month. Grandmother Esperanza standing in these same fields 40 years ago, her expression serious but her eyes twinkling with hidden knowledge. You knew, didn't you, Abuela? I whispered to her image. You knew exactly how this would all work out. The farm now employed 6 full-time workers, all earning fair wages with health benefits Derek had insisted on providing. Our certified organic status had opened doors to premium restaurant contracts, and the agritourism component brought visitors from across the Pacific Northwest. But the real transformation was in our family. Dad, his health improving with the reduction in stress, spent his mornings teaching Derek traditional farming techniques their grandfather had brought from Mexico. Mom had started a small business selling her homemade salsas and preserves at our farmer's market stand. Eliza, are you coming? Derek called from the porch. The kids want to see the warm composting system you designed. As I joined the tour group, I realized that Grandmother Esperanza's gift hadn't just been the land or even the legal victory over Derek's manipulation. Her real gift had been forcing all of us to discover who we truly were when stripped of our assumptions and pretenses. Derek had learned that his intelligence and drive could build something meaningful instead of just profitable. Our parents had learned that love didn't require choosing sides. And I had learned that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from defeating your enemies, but from transforming them into family again. The land Esperanza had protected now protected all of us, ensuring that future generations would inherit not just property, but values worth preserving. 1 year after the confrontation that changed everything, the Rodriguez family farm hosted its first annual harvest festival. Golden October sunlight streamed across fields where families picked pumpkins, children learned about sustainable farming, and the aroma of Mom's traditional Mexican dishes filled the air. I stood beside the memorial garden we'd planted for Grandmother Esperanza, watching Derek demonstrate organic pest control techniques to a group of fascinated visitors. His transformation had been complete. The manipulative golden child had become a passionate advocate for environmental agriculture. She would have loved this, Elena Vasquez said, joining me by Esperanza's memorial stone. At 70, she moved more slowly, but her eyes still sparkled with satisfaction. Your grandmother always said the land would teach Derek what he needed to learn if he was willing to listen. Did she really plan all of this? I asked, gesturing toward the celebration around us. She planned for justice. The rest, the healing, the partnership, and the community, that was all you and Derek choosing love over revenge. Marcus appeared beside me, slightly out of breath from helping set up the educational displays. The State Agriculture Commissioner is here. She wants to discuss featuring our farm in next year's Sustainable Farming Initiative. And there's a reporter from Modern Farmer magazine who wants to interview the sibling partnership that's revolutionizing family agriculture, Derek added, approaching our group with soil-stained hands and a grin that held no trace of his former manipulative coldness. As the festival continued around us, I felt the profound satisfaction of a legacy fulfilled. The land Esperanza had protected now supported 80 families through our CSA program, employed 12 community members at fair wages, and educated thousands of visitors about sustainable farming. But the real transformation was in our family. Dad, his health fully restored, spent his afternoons teaching traditional farming techniques to local high school students. Mom's preserves business had grown into a small regional success. Derek had found purpose beyond profit, and I had learned that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't what you receive, but what you choose to build with it. That evening, as the last visitors departed and we cleaned up the festival grounds together as a family, I thought about the scared, angry young woman who had walked out of the hospital room a year ago. She couldn't have imagined that her brother's betrayal would ultimately lead to this: a thriving farm, a healed family, and a legacy that honored both business success and environmental stewardship. Grandmother Esperanza had been right about everything. The land had chosen its keeper, not through manipulation or legal maneuvering, but through the simple act of loving it enough to transform conflict into collaboration. Standing in the fields where 4 generations of Rodriguez women had worked, dreamed, and planned for the future, I finally understood what true inheritance really meant. It wasn't about money or property or even family businesses. It was about values passed down, wisdom preserved, and the courage to choose healing over revenge. The harvest was complete, and the legacy would continue. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.